First of all, I'm a little bit of a weirdo. I have always loved ancient languages, and maybe that is not 100% normal. In college, I studied philosophy and the philosophy of language, and I learned words to put around my instinct that the shape of your language is a reflection of and also an influence on the shape of your thought. As a college student in the 70s, I wished for an alternative to Western individualism, and I looked for a more fluid and holistic way of understanding the world in the Far East. I studied ancient Chinese, and in graduate school, I read the Confucian and Taoist classics in the original. It was a profound and transformational experience. But in the end, as much as I loved those texts, I never felt like they were mine. And eventually my sense of satisfaction ran out. I told a wise friend about this at the time, who reminded me that I'm Jewish and that the Jews have their own tradition of treasuring ancient texts. And maybe if I wanted something more connected to me, I might look there. Fast forward, this advice brought me to the world that I have inhabited for the last 35 years. A living tradition of text study that, for me, opened up into practices that shape every aspect of my life and connect me to a grounded community within which I could build a family. So maybe it's the peculiarity of my personal connection to language, but for me, owning classical Hebrew makes the tradition mine. It collapses the time gap and lets the stories tumble down to me directly without mediation. Hebrew empowers my participation in Jewish life, and my participation in Jewish life drives my appreciation of Hebrew. Torah and its layers of interpretation, including our liturgy, has been the sustenance of our civilization for millennia. And by removing the veil of translation, I become a participant in the spiraling interpretive conversation that has made these ancient texts new in every historical era. And I can experience them not as historical documents, but as part of a living organism.
Thank you, Helen, so much. We're going to turn to Vardit now.
Thank you, Toda Rabba. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm an Israeli and Hebrew is my first language. I grew up in a home in which my parents, my mother who was a survivor and my father who was a pioneer, Chalutz, for them Hebrew was not only a language of communication, but it was a miracle. I wasn't allowed to speak any other language at home. It wasn't until I was 17 and I was sent by the Israeli Scouts to be a counselor in a camp that I realized that the language that I actually speak carries within it the tradition and the history of my own people. What was frustrating, that it was very difficult to teach the kids how to speak the language, my language. And it wasn't until I moved to South America, following my husband, that I started to learn Spanish. And I realized that I could actually conquer the language very easily. But my students never did. And I've started to ask myself questions. What is going wrong here? What is not working so well? And when I came to the state and I became the head of the Hebrew program at Brandeis University, I started to ask these questions and look for pedagogies that will help my students to conquer the language and to find ways to actually educate other educators how to use these pedagogies in order to achieve these goals. So as a result, we opened a Hebrew program for educators, a degree program at Brandeis, and then later on at Middlebury College. And I'm back at Brandeis now to do the same things on a national scale, believing that the key to acquire the language is to have the excellent Hebrew educators. I'll stop here and you will hear more later. Toda.
Thank you so much, Vardit. And Daria? you in the Hebrew language.
Yeah, been great. So, so as a synagogue rabbi, I'll do it on sevens, right? So we know the number 7 in Hebrew is Sheva. So my life and over the flow of 7 points with Hebrew. I'm a Hebrew school dropout. Half a year is all I did. I remember learning ba, abba, ba. Right? You can hear I learned the alphabet. I only got up through Lamed, but I learned and I called my parents Abba and Ima because it was something real and it was something alive. I used to dance to the Hasidic Song Festival records. I didn't know what it was, but it was fun music. It was Hebrew. Later, when I was studying at Brandeis with Vardit, it's like, oh my gosh, what I'm belly dancing to on the day of Shabbat. This is what the offerings are. Oh my gosh, I had no idea, but I was connecting to music and just connecting to the sounds. Years later, I studied in college at Brandeis with Vardit. And then I went to Israel as a junior year abroad. And I remember just using the language. I had only 1 year of Hebrew under my belt, but using the language and hearing the difference when someone said, Slicha, and I turned and he said, Lo lecha lach. And I knew immediately, right, just the nuance and the wonder of Hebrew that doesn't exist in English, of how you can understand what's going around you in a different way. And had, of course, so many powerful experiences in Hebrew and in Israel. So there's a third one, ba abba ba, singing to V'yom Shabbat, being in Israel, lach lecha. I came back, got a master's in education, was teaching at a day school, and I remember wondering about the religious pieces, right? I was teaching at the day school because of my Hebrew was the strongest piece. And I said, I don't know a lot of the other things. He said, don't worry, you've got the Hebrew, we'll help you with the rest. And I was there, and I remember teaching the children the tefillah about Yotzer Or Uvorei Choshech. There's a wonder and miracle about light and darkness, and we have the opportunity to put aside our questions about God, King, Master of the universe, and tap into that miracle of light and darkness. Number 5, I went to rabbinical school. I was exempt from biblical Hebrew because of my modern Hebrew at that point. I had gotten the Hebrew award, went back, had been at Ulpan. I was exempt from biblical Hebrew, and I could look at the text and not understand and translate perfectly, but I could get a good sense of what was going on at the different levels of Hebrew. Number 6, Kiddush. I was in California doing startup Jewish community, nature connected, and leading Kiddush outside. When you have the Shemaim and you have the Aretz, is a magnificent, radically different experience that I really invite you all to go to. Sheva, I come into the synagogues, I return into the synagogues, bringing all this together and saying, wait a minute, what's going on? How can we weave together so many pieces I'll be speaking about shortly, about Sheva, the miracle of 7, the miracle of 7. Oh, that's the same word as Shavua, I learned when I was in Israel. Oh, that's the same as the holiday Shavuot. Oh, that's the same as Shiva. Suddenly these random words all connect together and shoot out into all sorts of meanings and bring together the wholeness of what it can mean to be Jewish through the Hebrew language.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to ask Rabbi Michael Cohen if he could be the Kol, the voice of the Kahal, of all of you, and share with us, one after the other, some of the experiences with Hebrew language that were transformative for you. So, Michael, would you do that for us, please? You're muted, Michael.
Okay, great.
Now.
Okay. Lois said, I sat in on my older brother's bar mitzvah Hebrew lessons. Phyllis, when as an adult, I finally learned to read Hebrew and was able to recite Mourner's Kaddish in memory of my father, who would have been very proud of me. Bob, first serious interest via Reformed Summer Camp. Many people are summer camp are going to see a theme here. Most serious content 1 year, including Ulpan at Hebrew U, a second year later studying Hebrew at Pardes in Jerusalem. Caitlin, learning to read and translate Talmud at Savara and Shel Mala. Herb, 6 summers, and the summers again, at Hebrew-speaking Camp Yavna, associated with Hebrew Teachers College, which in the 1960s was truly Ivrit be'Ivrit. I have remained proficient in spoken Hebrew throughout my life. Randy, I take various Hebrew adult Jewish classes, some with text, and I didn't know how to decipher the text for myself. I knew Dan Cederbaum and through him got to Rabbi Plotkin's class, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Luis, as a teacher at the Prosdor of Hebrew College of Boston's summer trip to Israel, we went to Sde Boker and heard David Ben-Gurion give the group a talk in Hebrew. He also came to Hebrew College a year or two later, and we got to see him and listen to him speak in Hebrew again. The uncensored Bible also affected my interest. Removing the veil is why I love learning Hebrew, says Karen. Deborah, first as a student in Skokie, Illinois, and then later now in Orlando, Florida. As a teacher, Hebrew has connected me to the Jewish people. I'm trying to find the best ways to connect with students and engage them with reading Hebrew in primary grades. David, I am a poet who attended Talmud Torah in the Lower East Side of New York. When I was a child, I fell away from Judaism and Hebrew studies for many years, gradually coming back to it as a parent and a congregation member of the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. But Rabbi Plotkin has galvanized my excitement about reading Hebrew to the point where I can truly read it as a poet I am. And it at its very root, far beyond what any translation can do. And just as she said, biblical Hebrew has become a living language for me.
Thank you so much, Michael. Quite a variety, an interesting variety of connections to Hebrew. We're going to turn back to our panel now to expand on some of the things they hinted at in their opening comments. I suppose as I turn back to Earl, I really should have in the background something from Camelot, because among other things, we will be talking about a time where Ein Zo Agadah wasn't just a vision that Kaplan's view of the centrality of Hebrew was living incarnate within particular communities. And I think Earl will share some glimpses of that and perhaps offer some reasons of why that feels like paradise lost to us these days. Earl, it's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. In 1991, sociologist William Helmreich gave a talk at an event celebrating the centennial of the Minneapolis Orthodox congregation Knesset Israel. In the 1960s and the 1970s, a number of my Talmud Torah classmates, this supplementary communal program, were members of Knesset Israel, including several who attended the local Orthodox day school and then attended the communal Talmud Torah in the afternoon and evening. That's something of what I mean by having grown up in a cohesive and coherent Jewish environment. But by the time Helmreich gave his talk, those days in Minneapolis were nearly over. And the one observation I still remember him making is that it was common in Orthodox circles to believe that if they just waited patiently, it wouldn't be long before the bulk of Jewish community resources, along with the very identity of the American Jewish populace, would be theirs. In the 30 years since Helmreich's talk, the Orthodox sectors of the Minneapolis and St. Paul Jewish communities have become largely self-contained, except for funding. And within these confines rests much of what remains of extensive Jewish education in classical Jewish sources using Jewish languages, but absent the inclusive vision of peoplehood and progressive understanding of Jewish social responsibilities that was once the beating heart of the communities I grew up in and began my teaching in. I grew up and began that teaching in communities that signaled to their youth that they, along with the larger Jewish world, anticipated and needed the students' acquisition of the learning they were being provided. These were communities that signaled that they awaited that learning. Communities whose teachers, my teachers, when by chance we met one another on the street, would of course initiate the conversation in Hebrew. I emphasize I'm talking about a few blocks from my home. I didn't have to go to summer camp. I didn't even have to go to Israel to speak Hebrew on the street. I just had to walk down the block. They were, to use Daniel Elazar's terms, national, cultural, Hebrew invested communities, intensely and intimately molded across the denominational spectrum by labor Zionism, a labor Zionism which in turn, Binyamin Hashav would argue, had been shaped by the resurgence of Hebrew in 19th and early 20th century Jewish intellectual circles, and that the state of Israel resulted, Hashav concluded, from, quote, an ideology that created a language that forged a society that became a state. Language learning, of course, takes time, focus, purpose. The Minneapolis Talmud Torah was a 7.5-hour-a-week supplementary program, and in St. Paul, it was a minimum of 5 hours. The Twin Cities Talmud Torahs, through the end of the 20th century, used this time to focus on instruction in multi-layered Hebrew, spoken and literary, beginning with Tanakh and Mishnah, and then more recent Jewish literatures. And as I said, Encyclopedia Judaica noted that the results were striking and were an expression of an integrated sense of communal self. As a Beit Midrash student in Minneapolis, I studied Amichai's Kol Yisrael radio play, B'Yom Bo Nikbar Martin Buber. While a decade later, my Midrasha students in St. Paul studied Moreh Nevuchim once again in Hebrew. And I'd only add in this regard that my St. Paul Talmud Torah day school students, and I say St. Paul Talmud Torah to emphasize that the day school's home was in the same communal agency. These were communities that put their educational resources together and then broadcast them throughout the community. That day school shared curricula, of course, and faculty with its sister supplementary program. Both programs were informed by the same educational vision and used curricula fully in keeping with Mordechai Kaplan's assertion that Shmirat HaSafa eina muvtachat la'am bilti im sifrut HaSafa hahi notenet lanehanin mimena sipuk ruach kol na'aleh letiferet v'la'emet ad shehem mokirim et HaSafa kichli machazik arachim ruchaniim. Holding on to this language isn't guaranteed to the people unless the literature of the language gives those who are nourished by it a sense of such elevated beauty and truth that they cherish the language itself as an instrument for holding on to spiritual values. But there's no purpose in lauding those days if there's nothing constructive we can learn from them. And so I would close in this way. The declining prominence of Hebrew in American Jewish life no doubt reflects the increasingly tangled relationship between American Jews, the state of Israel, and Israelis, between Orthodox enclaves and what I would describe as a broad, diffusive Jewish cultural market. Comprehensive peoplehood as an irreducible and non-replaceable aspect of self has been in decline among American Jews for several generations. The horrors and trauma of the mid-20th century, along with Israel's early years, deflected this declining trajectory, but it seems clear enough now that it wasn't derailed. And the evaporation of all Jewish languages, but especially Hebrew, is a primary symptom of these developments, and with it, hakarat hasafa kikli machazik arachim ruchaniim, treasuring the language as a tool for holding on to spiritual values.
Earl, thank you. This next expression is Yiddish, not Hebrew, but in Yiddish they say the refuah comes before the makkah, that there are always holy sparks of opportunities. And those nitzosot, those holy sparks, we turn to our next three panelists, and we're going to turn to Helen. I'm pleased to say that the program she's going to describe was sponsored in part by the Kaplan Center last year in the first several years of it taking off. We were proud of that, and we've been delighted to see it move Mechayo El Chayo, from strength to strength. So Helen, please. Oh, I'm sorry, and please keep dropping your comments into the chat room. Michael will capture those and we'll return to them a little bit later.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'd like to speak briefly first about my experience at Swarthmore College, where I was co-founder of a program called the Beit Midrash, and I taught there part-time for about 20 years. And then I'd like to describe the program that Jeffrey mentioned and my current work with adult learners, and then offer just the tiniest glimpse into an example of what might begin to hint at what I mean by this relationship I mentioned earlier between language and thought. So when Kaplan discusses education in the passages that Jeffrey shared with the four of us, it sounds like he's mostly thinking about children, but he does mention Jewish studies, scholarship, and departments of Hebrew language and literature at universities. But at a small liberal arts college like Swarthmore, there's so many pressures, financial, political, numerical. Those departments never came to be. What I and my colleagues developed is something oblique to those programs, something very lightweight that found an audience among Jewish, Christian, some Muslim students, and also just linguists and classicists. Our Beit Midrash was a comfortable, inviting room lined with books, and the main offering was a sequence of courses in biblical Hebrew with ongoing reading sections after that. And there were always extracurricular study groups, cracking open, bilingual editions of Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, as well as Bible. For Jewish students, most of them with secular backgrounds, this was a way to tap into something connected with identity while using methods that held up to the intellectual standards of the rest of their education. I discovered that many of them, and you may not be surprised to hear this, and it was true of both Christian and Jewish students, some of them felt a lack of authenticity in the version of religion that they had been offered as children, as though the honesty with which they'd been encouraged to approach every other intellectual endeavor didn't apply to this sphere. And for these students, encountering the Bible in the original felt revolutionary. They learned to recognize the perspectives of different translators, and they learned the roots of the interpretive traditions. Meanwhile, throughout my time at Swarthmore, I've also been building Makom Torah, a small Jewish learning project that at this stage is mostly involved in Jewish education for adults and mostly online. Thanks to Dan Cederbaum, Zichrono Livracha, Makom Torah has in recent years become more and more focused on teaching Hebrew language, and specifically the Hebrew of Torah and liturgy. Dan tapped into a small geyser of interest among adults of all ages and backgrounds to really understand the Bible by reading it in Hebrew. Inspired by Dan's vision, and based on what I learned teaching at Swarthmore, I have developed a new biblical Hebrew curriculum designed to fast-track encounter with the text. And I've now taught parts of it at Swarthmore, parts at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I'm working through the whole thing with a second cohort of adults now. So Dan and I put this class together, out there together, And then halfway through the first round, he left us. He left me to do it on my own. And maybe it's Dan's spirit continuing to give me a hand, but even in round 2, the Zoom screen is full, and I'm steadily gathering a third cohort to begin next fall. I've got 2 weekly reading groups, one of alumni of this program, and one that has been reading together for at least 15 years, reading texts in Hebrew. So what's driving this? Why are sane adults with lives, modern people, willing to spend their precious time and brain power struggling over the intricacies of biblical Hebrew grammar? The Kaplan quotations that framed this webinar don't say much about adult education. But the first of Kaplan's 5 goals, before he even gets to Hebrew language, is that Hebrew education should support participation in Jewish life. And in our time and place, as in most eras, a great deal of that involves the recitation of Hebrew in prayer and Torah reading. And that's why we put such a lot of work into getting Hebrew to come out of the mouths of our B'nai Mitzvah and having them offer a Devar Torah. Because being a grown-up in Jewish life means participating in learning and teaching. And somehow that keeps coming back to Hebrew texts. But for many of our folks in our congregations, in our communities, a lot of people did not grow up inside a circle of rich Jewish learning. And there's a sense in their hearts that they're perpetual outsiders. So people are knocking on the door. This is an issue of democracy, one of the foundational concepts of Kaplan's Deweyan approach. Think about this. For most of its history, until Vatican II, the language of liturgy and Bible reading in the Catholic Church was Latin. Most lay Catholics did not know Latin and relied on their priests for that. And this supported the hierarchical structure in which meaning making went mostly one way from top to bottom. This was never the case in Rabbinic Judaism. It had an inherently democratic structure. Everybody, even some of the women, can you imagine? Okay, maybe not literally everybody, but everybody in some sense of the word was offered an education in Hebrew. In the shtetls, when the cart drivers were on break from driving carts, they went to the cart driver's Beit Midrash for Daf Yomi. And there were people who thought that the salvation of the world depended on every Jewish brain holding a complete understanding of Torah. So maybe recovering Hebrew for our generation and expanding it to include me and you is really a big deal. So I'm going to try to show you a teensy little example of what I mean when I talk about the relationship between language and thought. I'm kind of talking to the wrong audience here because everybody here knows more Hebrew than I, speaks better Hebrew than I. Although you probably don't know as much about Dageshes as me, but you probably speak much better Hebrew than me. But you know, the question is, what happens when you stop translating and start to understand Hebrew in its own idiom? How do things look different? So what I'm going to mention is the tip of an iceberg. It's a small thing, and I don't know if it will loom large for you at all. It's just a teaser, but here it is. Biblical Hebrew expresses time very differently from the languages of Europe and America. And you can see this in the simplest sentence structure. The simplest sentence in Biblical Hebrew consists of 2 words, a subject, which is a noun or a noun phrase, and a predicate, something you want to say about that noun. Maybe the subject is the house, and you want to say that it's big. That's the predicate. In Hebrew, the subject and the predicate just sit next to each other, and that's a sentence. Habayit gadol. In English, every sentence needs a verb, and every verb is associated with a tense that indicates past, present, or future. If we want to make a subject-predicate sentence in English, we use a form of the verb to be as a connector between the subject and what we want to predicate. to say about it. So even the simplest sentence in English declares itself as part of a past narrative, or as a description of a present situation, or as a possibility for the future, but not all of those. So lots of Hebrew sentences can't really be translated into English because there's no time frame indicated in the Hebrew. The subject and the predicate are simply associated as though there's an invisible equal sign between them. If I say David Melech, it means David a king. But as a translator, I have to choose David is a king, David was a king, David will be a king, right? Baruch Hashem. There's no time frame in there. In Hebrew, it means all of those things. Is, was, will be. As a translator, you have to choose a tense based on context. But it's important to realize that the Hebrew sentences can hold all the time frames at once. Does that change anything? I'm not sure. For me, it feels like it might be big. So the thing is that most of the great midrashim, most of the great interpretive moves of our tradition are much, much richer if you understand the untranslatable peculiarities of the language. And maybe sometime we can go into that, some more specific examples of that.
Well, Helen, not only sometime, but while you were talking to people, actually friends of mine from Cleveland, Louise and Joel Freilich, said, how can I sign up for this? So I'm going to ask you, Helen, if you would put into the chat room your email and any immediate link you have, because I'm sure they're not the only one. So thank you for that excursion into Biblical Hebrew. And I will turn now to Vardit for some more perspective on Hebrew and the teachers of Hebrew.
Right, thank you so much. I hope my internet will behave. Since I'm really far away, I'm trying to make sure that I might speak quickly or fast to just make sure I say whatever I want to say. I'm going to share a short presentation with you right now, and I'm going to put it on a mode. Well, let's see, on a slides mode for a second, right here. Why it doesn't work? Okay, just bear with me a minute. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. I am going to do it right now. It doesn't work. Okay.
Okay, but we can see it, so please.
You can see it. Okay, fine. So I'm going to start by saying that the big story about Hebrew education in America is the gap between the investment and the outcome. What we are trying to do through our Hebrew education programs is to really close this gap and make sure that we are successful in helping learners acquire the language. But I want to lay out some of the principles that guide us when we train teachers. So first of all, yes, we are connected the language to identity, especially for when we train teachers to teach in Jewish education. And probably you know that there are so many identities between religious, ethnic, linguistics, and so forth, but the most powerful connection of language to identity is the cultural identity. And you probably know that this definition about the cultural identity, which is the sum of the ways of living, of course, and the tradition that it transmitted from one generation to another. And the idea is to internalize the system of beliefs of the group of the people that speak this language. And I have to bring a quote from a poet who was very famous because he was also a language educator, who said, Yuli Bari, who said that the language, the words, carries within it the history, the tradition, the very life of people. Now, I'm talking about this concept, and you have to understand that Hebrew teachers have to be trained to believe in this idea that really this is what the language is all about. And I'm going to continue and say that we cannot even conceive the people without a language or a language without a people. The two are one and the same. And we dedicate a lot of time in our programs to show that this is really about, the language is really about the meaning of the culture and the sum of all the layers of what the language brings to, and as a reflection of the people who speak it. Now, the idea that language is a human trait was also, of course, was expressed by Chomsky, the famous linguist, who actually said, and is being approved, that we are born with the language a mechanism. He called it LAD, language acquisition device. And the reason that I'm bringing it now here, because this is explain a lot of the ways that language is being processed when somebody is learning a language, either a first language or a second language. But what is very interesting is the way he described the language, the meaning of the language, and it's connected to what the two presenters said before, that the language has the complexity of a language is because it's both a meaning carrier and a meaning maker. And this is a very complex notion to be able to then teach others how to get the meaning from the language, which means they understand the platform of the language. Helen, you mentioned the grammar and so forth that carries the meaning of these cultural ideas, and at the same time participate and be part of this community that speak the language and be a maker, a meaning maker. So this is a very complex idea that carries within a lot of pedagogy and how to make it happen for our learner. And the real challenge in teachers' educations, for Hebrew teachers' education, is how to support learners to become proficient in Hebrew, which is defined as a second language. And the idea is that in order for the learners to be able to understand the meaning, but at the same time create their own meaning in order for the sake of participation, they have to acquire the language. Acquire meaning internalization, make the language part of who they are, they're part of their who-ness. But it has to be in the context of the culture, which is the authentic real life language. And not only knowing about the language by learning it. So we differentiate a lot between acquisition and learning. Learning, I always compare it to somebody who is looking from the outside, while acquiring, I'm an insider, I'm participating, I'm able to be part of the group that speaks the language. So the solution for this really is by developing academic programs to train Hebrew educators. And this is not an easy task. I've been doing it for 20 years now through Middlebury and Brandeis. And the idea is to support teachers in understanding the culture of the language that they teach. And the culture has to do with Jewish and Israeli culture, both. We dedicate a lot of time for this. But we also teach them how language is actually processed in this language acquisition device that Chomsky is talking about. And we also train them through other theories and train them in the practice. This is the first group ever to graduate from Middlebury with a master's degree in teaching Hebrew as a second language. So we see it in the solution. I want to show you another principle that we teach our teachers to be able to use when they're teaching the language. And this is an approach. One of the things that I have to say before I'm talking about this is the fact that language acquisition or second language acquisition is a discipline. It has a lot of research and theories and pedagogy and so forth. What we do is actually adopted or adjusted to the Hebrew teaching. This is an approach that being used in other languages. At Brandeis, we adjusted or modified for Hebrew. And the beauty of this approach is, and this is very crucial as a reaction to the state of Hebrew education in America, is that no matter what level you are able to participate in the language. Not only to be, you don't have to be, first of all, to understand the language in order to be able to, I mean, you don't have to spend years understanding the language and the platform of the language in order to be able then to become what we call a meaning maker. And these are 4 levels of language development, of acquisition in learners, and we teach our teachers how to actually make it happen for their learners. And this is very crucial. It was, I would say, it shifted the way people are thinking now about teachers' education. So before I stop, I just want to share with you something related to the connection between modern Hebrew and classical Hebrew. In his book, Rabbi Rosenthal, another linguist, shows us that actually we all speak the language of the Bible, even if we speak slang. And these are some of examples that I'm going to share with you. For example, אני רעב, אני מת מרעב, I'm starving, and this is even advertisement for M&M using this. Or another simple question, מתי אוכלים ארוחת בוקר? Every word is in the Bible, and a very important sentence that is very it's being used today a lot. ראש הממשלה קרא לשרים לישיבה. This is all words are coming from the Bible. So by studying a modern Hebrew, you actually studying also the language of the Bible. I'll stop here, and if you want to hear more about how we trained and how successful we are in training these teachers, as of now, we graduated 200 teachers, and they're making a lot of impact in the field. The plan is to do more of this in the future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Vardit, thank you so much for those perspectives. And now we're going to turn to the world of congregational learning and education, and to Rabbi Daria to take us there. So Daria, please.
Great, thank you. So I want to add that in addition to that, what I laid out about my journey with Hebrew, I loved languages as a child. I was exempt going to Brandeis with my French already. I'd taken Spanish, was tired of a classroom environment, took Hebrew, went to Israel. I've lived in Japan for 3 years. I like languages. And one of the things, as Vardit was talking about the cultural piece that I really got to understand through my relationship with languages and living and traveling abroad, as I'm sure others here have also perhaps have, is right, just the fun and the joy and the nuance that comes in different languages as they express what does it mean to be alive in different ways, right? So as we know from our own experience with whatever languages we have, oh, right, you know, el gusto es mío, right? Like there's something about that just feels different than the pleasure is mine in English, right? Like there's different from the Spanish to the English. There's different ways that languages help us think and be in the world. That together with the piece of my saying, I'm a Hebrew school dropout. So I really knew how to feel uncomfortable in a synagogue setting, and with a Siddur and with the Torah and with everything going on in a synagogue, because I only knew half the Hebrew alphabet and I knew some songs, but I really was uncomfortable in a synagogue setting, and I didn't find much of a connection for much of my life until I was about to apply to rabbinical school. I'm doing some learning before then that, of course, led to that point. So as I grew into my adulthood, for me, the focus of flourishing and self-actualization was really powerful. And in my rabbinate, that's what really deepened more and more. That's who I am here on this world to be, is to help people, in Kaplan's words, right? To help God be that process that makes for self-actualization, self-realization. And as through my journey in congregations, I've really been asking myself, what are some of the pieces that get in that way? Are there places where we are disconnecting, where in fact we could be reconnecting and allowing pathways for that flow of self-actualization to come through? And as I saw over and over in the different congregations, whether it was as a student rabbi or in the congregations where I was holding when I was the rabbi, is how Hebrew was a great, great disconnector. And yet I knew from my traveling and living abroad that languages, you don't have to be an expert and native born to get a sense of the language and to really be able to communicate and have that joy and fun and understand the cultural pieces. And so what became so clear to me is, what if we could actually shift our relationship to Hebrew such that Hebrew actually became that portal to that sense of fun and confidence. And I know something, because when I looked in that Siddur with those second graders and I got to teach them Yotzer Or Uvore Choshech, oh my gosh, isn't it wondrous that we have light and darkness? And I knew Or and Choshech, light and darkness, just from living in Israel and from the modern Hebrew. What could become possible when we use Hebrew as that? So to just share a couple slides that will help give you a visual sense of this. So I feel like this is often what it can be like in synagogues, Hebrew in synagogues today, right? Where there's so many things we're trying to do. We have month and year, we've got our year cycle, right? And all the holidays, and we've got so many Jewish texts and what's happening with Israel. We've got life cycle, other like Torah and Shabbat and other Tanakh. Diaspora, how are we connecting to Jews across the world in addition to Jews in America, in our own communities? Hebrew is in there, and we're teaching the kids Hebrew so that they can become B'nai Mitzvah. Maybe we're doing some adult language learning for adult B'nai Mitzvah. We're a shul, a synagogue, so there's opportunities for not just people to show up across the generations, multi-generational, but intergenerational. In synagogues, how are we really bringing intentionality and consciousness to the deepening of relationships across the age demographic? Because it's so broken in our society, right? And we see so much loneliness, isolation, suicide, drugs, all sorts of things because of that breakdown in society and the web, the fabric of society. We have our Siddur and what's going on with that, and learn it, right? Reading to learn that, to say the prayers, to lead the prayers. Then there's a whole culture pieces and what Kaplan Center has done before about that, and history. And then we've got Shabbat. So, right, so this is so many things we're trying to balance, and there's probably more that I missed here. But what if we kind of shift back off from like all these multiple things that are going around? So we're swirling and we're trying to balance, and we instead look at, I wonder, could Hebrew be a portal to self-actualization, the unique portal that nothing else can actually play this role? But what if Hebrew actually is that secret magic sauce to the flourishing that actually the whole world depends on, and that we as Jews have that opportunity to step into our more active potential? If we create a context where Hebrew is the foundation, Hebrew is flowing through the tree, it's the trunk, it's the sap, Hebrew is the air, and the blue above here, you can't really, you may not, there we go. Hebrew is the rain, Hebrew is the sun, right? If Hebrew is this whole context, that, as we talk about with Kaplan, right? Behaving, believing, belonging, these different aspects. Hebrew is infused through our sacred rhythms. When we learn Hebrew in the way of that cultural portal, right, that linguistic portal, then the sacred rhythms that we can be exploring Shabbat in the week, right? When we say Kiddush and we do it outside, we are claiming this fuller capacity. The month, the year cycle, the language and the rhythms that are imbued and embedded within the holidays, they get to mean something deep within our core. The whole life cycle from birth, b'nai mitzvah, death, right, weddings, the whole life cycle becomes to mean something different when we end up looking at Hebrew and using it as that portal. Of course, with the sacred texts, then the Siddur isn't just a book that we're reading these sounds, saying these words, and looking at the transliteration and the translation, but it becomes alive because the words are alive. And same with the other sacred texts we have. Hebrew ends up allowing us to have intergenerational play. It's an equal opportunity organizer for youth, elders, those with children, those without children, to come together and to have experiential opportunities for playing, for learning, for creating together. It connects us, of course, to Israel, the diaspora, the arts. There's such opportunity when we really harness that potential of Hebrew. And so that's what we've been exploring and playing with here at Oseh Shalom. And thanks to Vardit's work, and the different possibilities that I've learned about through the methodologies that are really out there right now, and the teaching practices and the teachers that are going out, as she said, you know, where the fertile ground has been nourished and the rain is coming, and we have this opportunity to use synagogues as that unique hub that they are to really, you know,
Thank you,
nourish these
Daria,
so
so much. Our panel first met together to rehearse on Tu B'Shvat on that very day. So you can see the tree metaphor has taken some deep roots and an interesting application. I want to thank all of our panelists. And now I'd like to call on James Susswine, the president of the Kaplan Center, to introduce a cameo performance by one of the great stars, perhaps the great star of Kaplanian insights and biography. Jane, who are we going to hear a few words from now before we turn to the questions of our group?
It's my great pleasure to introduce Mel Scult, who is Kaplan's biographer, has knew Kaplan in the early met him in the early 70s, and has not only studied his work, but written about it beautifully for all of us. Mel?
Okay, thank you very much for that exaggerated introduction. So I want to state the ultimate value of honesty. Kaplan felt that there was no religion and no spirituality without honesty. So I want to look for a minute or so at the matter of Hebrew and Kaplan, and to be as honest as possible. A word about my own background, which I think is important in terms of the future of Hebrew. I am a seminary product, and the seminary in the mid-century, through the Teachers Institute, which trained the majority of teachers of Hebrew throughout the United States. The language of instruction was Hebrew, the texts were Hebrew, the tests were Hebrew, everything was Hebrew. And so we studied Hebrew for 5 years through speakers who were absolutely outstanding. The seminary is no longer, unfortunately, committed in the same way to Hebrew, so much as I understand. But I do want to emphasize in my own background, the Hebrew camp movement was very, very, very fundamental in terms of my knowledge of Hebrew. It's important, I think, in terms of Kaplan, Hebrew was at the very top of his scale of values, of course. And I think it's important in terms of him as a person to distinguish between writing Hebrew, reading Hebrew, and speaking Hebrew. Kaplan wrote Hebrew. His style is an Americanized Hebrew. It's not bad. And for those of you who have access to the internet, you can read Kaplan in Hebrew in the diary. Many of you know my association with the diary. The diary in 1925, at the dedication of the Hebrew University, is written in Hebrew, and in 1937 to 39 is written in Hebrew because Kaplan was at the Hebrew University. So writing was not a problem. Reading was not a problem, of course, and he read Hebrew all the time. It was speaking that was the problem. And I want to turn for a minute to the Kaplan diary and read 2 selections which indicate the problem. In other words, he advocated Hebrew as top of the line, important, and so on and so forth. But the actual reality, which is always what one finds in the diary, the actual reality was something different. In September 19th, 1929, he writes the following: at the opening exercises of the Teachers Institute tonight, which I conducted for the first time, I spoke in English. My enthusiasm about conversing in Hebrew is at present at a low ebb. Even Benderly, who originally was fanatical on the question of Ivrit, and who was regarded 15 years ago as the father of that method in this country, said to me tonight he had said many times before that the insistence upon Hebrew prattling is largely responsible for the failure of Jewish training in the Hebrew schools. That's a very, very powerful statement. But he preferred, this is talking about Benderly, he preferred this confession of his with the phrase Al Tagidu Bagat. You will know that, those of you. When I asked him, why not proclaim it? In other words, the predominance of Hebrew, the way in which it undermines the content, he said, why not proclaim it? And he answered that the assimilationists would exult and say, aha, haven't I told you that before? Okay, and in order to emphasize, a couple of years later, he writes the following: after all these years, I am still vacillating between emphasis on content, regardless of language, and upon Hebrew as indispensable to experiencing as a Jew. In the meantime, I am probably throwing away a golden opportunity to influence the lives of young people. In other words, in his desire to speak Hebrew and to make that the language of instruction, he is paying a very significant price in terms of influencing their thinking and making Jewish civilization clear. So I think that this has to be put into the hopper in terms of the future of Hebrew. My sense is that the camping movement is the key, the universities are the key, and we are she'erita pleta. We are a minority in terms of Hebrew speakers, and I guess it's going to remain that way.
Well, as always, Mel, thank you. We'll, that two-handed image of Fiddler on the one hand, on the other hand, needs 3 or 4 more hands as you help us see the complexity of Hebrew through Kaplan's perspective. And thank you as always. I'm going to take just a minute before we turn to Michael to talk a little more personally and professionally about the greatest experiment I ever engineered in my years in Jewish education. So many of you know, but not all of you, that over the last 30 years, I directed the Jewish education program at Siegel College and at the Rabbinical College. And for the Kaplan Center, I was a Hebrew teacher and a principal in 3 different religious schools. And I want to tell you how we went to the heights Shamala, the greatest heights of thought, to generate a program we called the Kiosks program. So here, imagine this: Society Hill Synagogue in Philadelphia, 1972. 4 rabbinical students are sitting around pondering what we're going to do for 15 minutes as we get ready for a movie that would be part of our afternoon program. And we put a couple things together in a very nonlinear way. One, we recognize that our kids are hungry when they come to us. They walk to us from their public schools. And 2, we recognize that there's a way perhaps to make Hebrew language alive by linking it to food. So the experiment in Kiosk that carried over to 4 different congregations is give us 15 minutes in the beginning of a day with our kids and make Hebrew language living and instrumental. Ma'at rotzah lishtot. What would you like to drink? And the rotzah meets tapuzim. And how was your day at school? And how are you feeling? That organic use of language for me was the great coming to terms with, I could never reach Kaplanian goals in terms of the depth of Hebrew, but I can create this place where students experience the rich language. And that allowed me to from a Kaplanian perspective to deal with the pragmatic exigencies and the difficulties that Mel and others have alluded to. So that kiosk experiment was near and dear, and look forward to other kinds of experimentation as well, of course. And now I'd like to turn to Rabbi Michael Cohen, who's been looking at your comments in the chat room to share a few of the questions. Perhaps he's grouped them. But Michael, it's all yours to bridge people's questions and back to the panel and other people who might want to respond.
Great. So early on in our second session here, Bob Tabek raised the question that there was a conflict between Hebrew and Yiddish in the 1930s amongst Jewish educators, which we all also paralleled even in the earlier conflict in Israel between whether German or Hebrew should be taught at the Technion. So if anyone wants to address kind of that historical battle of Earl.
Thank you. If I might say a word about that, I noticed the same comment, and I think my experience in the Midwest speaks to the issue. That is to say, in the Twin Cities and the Upper Midwest more generally, the Jewish left was never strongly communist. Almost exclusively, early on, labor Zionist, in tune with Midwestern farmer labor socialism. And the Jewish right was never strongly Hasidic, but as Daniel Elazar points out, heavily Litvak from the outset, which meant that coherence within our communities wasn't undermined by the kind of polarities one found in many other larger communities. And that made for an environment in which Hebrew could and did flourish, which simply leads me to this observation. It can't convey the message to our children that the community awaits you and the substantive time invested education you've received if there's no such community. And so the construction of effective Hebrew education must be in the context of the reconstruction of inclusive Jewish community. And I would stop there for now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sherwood, wait, I'm going up and down here. Sorry, I had it marked off here. So Sherwood raised the question, kind of a hurdle to our discussion here, with the plethora of amazing English translations. How essential is Hebrew in terms of all of this? And we know even within the Bereshit bara Elohim, we don't even know how to translate that within the original Hebrew. Even when we're dealing with Hebrew itself, we don't even know what it means. And the fact that for so many of our congregants and so many people within the movement, it used to be an excuse if you didn't know Hebrew, you couldn't participate. Now everything's in translation, for better and for worse. And I think, and Sherwood, if you want to add to your question here, how critical is that with this in-depth scholarship we have of English translations of biblical text?
Well, I think you've done an excellent job. Really, the essence of my comment is that I wonder whether Hebrew should serve as the initial entry point to, to Bible or to Jewish tradition. I think that really is the essence of my concern.
Anyone want to take that?
Panelists, others?
I'll make a comment. I think I hear a concern that it becomes a gatekeeping kind of a function, and that that lack of knowledge of Hebrew can keep people out of certain kinds of study, and we want to be open. Is that sort of where the concern is coming from, Sherwood?
Yes,
Well, I certainly I certainly share that concern. I don't think there in any way it should ever be a gatekeeping function, but I think I think that offering entry points through Hebrew whenever possible is a good thing. And I even think that good teachers can overcome people's lack of experience with Hebrew by explaining why these translations don't quite get at, say, what the commentators see. There are, when so many, if you look at Midrashim, so many of them seem like they're pulled out of the middle of nowhere, but they're responding actually to very specific grammatical and linguistic problems or peculiarities in the text that you can explain to people. And my hope is that as you do that, then they become a little bit more inspired to try to put in the work to learn a little bit of Hebrew. So hopefully it's a way of welcoming and not a way of pushing away. But I think your concern is an important one. And we have, whatever approach we take, it's always got to be about welcoming and about inspiring people to go deeper, and not about suggesting people that they don't know enough to participate.
Thank you, Helen. Randy, I see you have your hand up.
You're basically a person with very little training in Hebrew. It came through Helen's class. And I just want to say that I remember one of our conversations, not in detail, but when Helen was explaining about how the tenses or the concept of tense is different in biblical Hebrew, and different ways of interpreting the opening of Breshit. The conversation, it was a philosophical revelation, excuse the pun, and just learning that was so important. I understand how, like, if you don't know Hebrew and you can't study, that would be a way of keeping you out. But even if you don't learn Hebrew in depth and retain it forever, which is hard to do right now, if you're taught those things and I think it's so important. It was wonderful to have that knowledge and to see how the Bible can open up, and that it's not just the translation on the page. So knowing some things about Hebrew, I think, is incredibly important. And if you can continue to learn, that's great.
You're making my heart go flutter, Randy.
Yeah, Michael, I'd like to add just for
please.
A moment, and then please call on the next person, that if I look at adult Jewish learning, I've tried to write a little bit about this. There are two metaphors that seed the process of adult learning. One is literacy, where the key is the mastery of language, traditions, codes, and the other we can call the journey metaphor, which is my life is a journey. I'm taking steps. And one of the great challenges for us, I believe, is the wedding together of the literacy and the journey metaphors, because both are growth as individuals and communities of Jews and our ability to reflect the classical heritage that is our Yerusha are critically important, and there are cross connections between them. We just often fall prey to a bifurcation of the two.
Just to add one piece, building off of what Randy and Jeff that you just said, and Helen, is it's up to the educator and the individual together have the opportunity to really create a sense of I don't have to be a master to feel empowered, right? And it's that sense of, oh, I know a little bit more than I knew before, and look at this and look at that, as opposed to the overwhelm of I'm never going to know it all. That's okay. We never will know it all. And so how can we be empowered and excited by every little bit that we do know, as opposed to the overwhelm?
And just
Thank
to
you, Daria.
just to add,
Aaron, and then Luis and Freilich have their hands up too.
Yeah, just to add to Daria, even in second language acquisition, the field, we encourage what we call engagement in the language. It's not all or nothing. It's the engagement that makes the difference between crossing the line between an outsider and insider. So it's really based on a lot of research that it's really happening. Yeah.
And that's the Hebrew blessing for learning, right? Asok, the engagement with matters of Torah, not the mastery.
Louisa and Joel, and then Earl.
As a lay person who sometimes leads Torah study at Kol Halev in Cleveland, when I do look at a Torah portion, I have multiple translations and like to look at the different translations and then sometimes go back to the Hebrew when to see, like, you know, if something's translated differently. And I almost always say that that translation is commentary. And that's almost always one of my comments when I'm leading Torah study.
Earl?
Thank you. I would just add a word about Torah Sheba'al Peh. The essence of Torah Sheba'al Peh, what we so casually refer to as oral Torah sometimes, is to be found in the deep psychological difference between what might be read in a book, even a book of divine revelation, and what one hears face to face from one's teacher and among one's companion students. The early rabbinic insistence on the distinction had to do with embedding learning in personal relationship. And such learning is bound up in the relationships that can give words an enduring, living presence, living words in the living language in which they're spoken. Torah Sheba'al Peh, I think, should be taken at its word. It's about what happens when you hear Torah spoken, and the language makes a great deal of difference.
Thank you. Helen?
Can I say, I want to make a proposal. This is a very knowledgeable group, and I would welcome hearing lectures in Hebrew on the internet by somebody in this group or somebody that we might designate, historical, biographical, philosophical, whatever, from time to time. I try to tune into Van Leer, but they speak too quickly, and I always have trouble. So maybe I'm just longing for the days of my youth when I heard Halkin or Bavli speak about all kinds of issues. I hope maybe, Jeff, we can work towards doing that. I don't think on the internet there is an advanced but geared towards very knowledgeable Americans Hebrew lecture or conversation. And I think that would be a real contribution of the Kaplan Center.
Great idea.
Thank you, Mel. Helen? Muted.
You're muted.
All right. I was going to respond. Well, I want to raise up. I had a clear connection, but I got so interested in listening to Mel that I lost it. So I'm going to say make a comment that I wanted to make in response to the work of. It's in response to something Vardit said. She was pointing out the that when you speak modern Hebrew, you're speaking Tanakh Hebrew as well. And this is very, very important. And what I've learned, I lived in Israel for a year and then for 6 months, and I went to every level of every best ulpan in the world, and I did very well, and I've never felt like I could speak smoothly. Spoken language is not my great talent. And I don't, and as Israel, as modern Hebrew evolves, I'm getting worse and worse at hearing and understanding Hebrew, Israeli Hebrew, and I don't do it enough. But both for me, and I see clearly for all of my students, whether they're sophomore students or rabbinical students or adults or teens, if you went to Hebrew school and learned, or even if you sat in synagogue and heard Ha'el Hagadol, right? Then you can, when you learn how nouns and adjectives work, it's in your brain. You say, there's an aha. So all the work that Vardit is doing, that Daria is doing, that the kiosks that Jeffrey were describing, these are the things that set you on the path so that when you suddenly wake up and are hungry to be able to understand why all those translations are so different, and maybe to see that the reason is because the thing the Hebrew really says can't be captured in a translation. When you're at that point, you have enough in your little brain to have that, to hook it onto. And that's what I appreciate, even though in my own experiences with modern Hebrew, even though I feel like they're inadequate, they're enough to give me that hook, that it feels natural enough to learn the rest.
So Jeffrey, we've passed the 4:32 marker. Some guidance here on time.
Sure. So usually what we do, Michael, is we open it up entirely. We have kept most of our audience. We're very pleased about that. We know a few people have to leave. We know some other folks who may not even have put their question in are ready to stay around a little more. So we move into the mode now of allowing people to share a comment and come forward at this point. So formal questioning and answering has ended, but informal continues. So if anyone has something, especially people who haven't yet had a chance to share, let's do that. And I see my friend and colleague, Bob Tabak and Ofer, nice to see you again. Beit Halachni, who's been one of our presenters at past Kaplan Center webinars. If each of you could take a turn and then others join as well.
This is Bob Tabak. I wanted to follow, I had a similar thought to Mel, is how can we find, there are people at different levels with Hebrew and different experience, but there's a fair number of Americans who know a fair amount of Hebrew. And how can we provide opportunities? There almost never is a conversation, discussion, or lecture aimed at Americans or sponsored by an American organization that's in Hebrew. I'm not talking about meetings for Israeli expats. And like Germantown Jewish Center, where I'm a member, had for many years a Parashat HaShavua read group, which has faded during COVID. But it was peer led, and we did a discussion in Hebrew with texts in Hebrew, and we helped each other with Hebrew. Of the parasha once a month. And I would really, I feel my need to use Hebrew and not only be a reader or listener, which I find hard to do.
Thank you.
I would hope.
No, why don't we hear from Ofer, and then Mel will turn back to you. Ofer?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for this wonderful presentation and panel. I will try to be short, but my Talmud teacher, Dr. Meir Ayali, wrote in his memory, that when he first came to Israel, he went down of the boat in Haifa, and he was so anxious to hear a real Sabre speaking Hebrew, and he came with his biblical and Talmudic Hebrew. He said to a kid in Haifa, "Emor li yeled, ma shmecha?" And this kid replied immediately, "Chamor, ma echpat lecha?" So I hope most of us understand that this is a dialogue between two cultures, but also between two levels of the Hebrew. And I want to refer to this, what I feel is idealization of the Hebrew, because, and I want Vardit maybe to comment about it, we are trying to teach few words, a little bit of Hebrew, the beginning of conversation in Hebrew, and we want them, everybody to know biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic, Sidur Hebrew, and modern Hebrew at the same time. And I feel that it makes my students, I'm working for Rabbi Daria and a wonderful project that she's creating in an amazing congregation. But I feel that sometimes our students are confused between all the levels of the Hebrew. And I want to say that in Israel, there is a special edition of the Bible, which is called Tanakh Ram, which is a translation of the Tanakh into modern Hebrew. Because students in Israelis don't know how to read the Hebrew anymore. This was my comment and question.
I want to comment on Ofer Sabbat Beit HaLachmi. I remember very vividly a session at the home of Jack Cohen in Israel, and Ofer brought his class, which he had been teaching Kaplan, and I tell you the truth, the absolute truth. There never was a group that I have spoken to that I felt understood as much as the group that was taught by Ofer Beit HaLachmi. And so I want to say that. The other thing I want to say is that this is a book which I discovered many, many years ago. It's called Masechet Zichronotai. And it is a series of vignettes written by Rav Sa'ir, who was in Odessa in the years 1909 to 1910. And, everybody was there. Dubnov was there, Bialik was there, Achad Ha'am was there, everybody was there. And these vignettes are wonderful. And in terms of the Hebrew of this book and the vignettes about Hebrew figures, there is no book that surpasses this. It's called Masechet Zichronotai, and it's written in a pure Achad Ha'amian Hebrew of mid-20th century, and I recommend it very highly.
Thank you, Mel.
Can I just comment just one sentence to offer? I don't want to comment on the Israeli system, the education system in Israel, but I just want to tell you that the way we try to solve this issue is by really making the language educator, the Hebrew educator, an expert who can connect the dots for the students and make it right for the students and expedite in the acquisition processes. And the less time you have, such as in congregation school, the more expert you have to be. You don't have the luxury to lose time or to spend time unnecessarily. So this is why we found that the solution is really the education of the Hebrew teachers in a very rigorous academic program that can bring them to make it happen for the learners.
And Vardit, I've been wanting to remark about the secret synchronicity of all events in the universe. and particularly your notion of acquisition. This morning, I was looking up at a beautiful piece of calligraphy in our bedroom. And what does it say about getting a teacher or a friend? It doesn't say find, it says kanelecha, acquire for yourself. So that process of deep ownership is perhaps the same for friendships as for language, as for culture. It's very, very rich. And I think what I'd like to do is, before we end, see if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to offer a comment at this point to offer a comment, and if not, we will bring things to a close. But is there anyone who's been taking all of this in and wants to voice an appreciation, ask a question, share a puzzlement? It's all yours.
Sure, I'll say something. I would say if you've got, even basic intermediate Hebrew or something like that, and if you have children, and if you can raise them bilingually in your house, do it. Give them that head
Thanks,
start.
Michael. And what a great segue to thanking Michael for serving as our MC, Michael Cohen as MC. Appreciate that. And particularly to, again, to the Malmuds and the Rolfs who sponsored this, but particularly to our panel. What I got off of our Tu B'Shvat session saying, this is extraordinary, the depth of thought and analysis. And it was no less extraordinary today. So thank you to Earl, Vardit, to Daria and Helen, and the Kaplan Center was so glad to have hosted this important dialogue. It's part of a larger project, as some of you know, that we call the Great Kaplanian Report Card, of going back to those 5 issues. Helen did it in a very artful way, saying Hebrew isn't just about Hebrew, it's about participation in Jewish life. And we're looking now, 40 years after Kaplan's death, we're coming up to his yahrzeit, 90 years almost after Judaism as a civilization, to ask ourselves, how well are we doing in each of these arenas? And you can only do that in the spirit of honesty that Nell recommended to us. So thank you all for that. And I will say Tzoharayim Tovim. Good afternoon to everyone. Baruch Tiyah.
Thank you.
Caitlin, thank you as well for being our Zoom Gabbai and playing that wonderful Hebrew music in the beginning of the day.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a great talk, so very impressed. Oh, you're muted, Jeff. Oh, still can't hear you.
Mute. So Ulu mode. Go forth and study. There's a whole lot to think about still.
Absolutely.
Even more. Okay, thanks again.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.